Welcome back to StabtheDragon Productions for episode number 101, book review number 9. Today we're going to be looking at The Penguin Historical Atlas of the Vikings by John Haywood, coming out of London, The Penguin Group, 1995. It's 144 pages. Read this book January to March 2023. Outstanding. Now this is now the fourth book about the Vikings that I've read and reviewed in the past 7 months or so, beginning with Elsa Rosedal's book, The Vikings from 1999, Anders Winroth's book, The Conversion of Scandinavia, 2012, and then Martin and Hannah Whittock, their book, The Vikings from Odin to Christ, 2018. I really hadn't planned on doing all this, but I was working on an American history project and simply wanted to know the story of how the Vikings came to discover America. In high school, junior high, grade school, I knew about that. Never really saw anything about it in college. I was a history major, but that wasn't my area, I guess. And so all I knew was that Leif Erikson, about the year 1000, had discovered America up in Canada, in Newfoundland. And that's pretty much all I knew. And I knew vaguely who the Vikings were. They were Scandinavians who terrorized Europe during the Middle Ages at some point with their raids and all of that. But that's it. And so I started researching this a little bit just to broaden my American history understanding. And bam, I got hit with Thor's hammer, Molinar, I guess, and here I am stuck in the Middle Ages of Scandinavia, Britain, the Orkneys, Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, and I can't get out. Now this book, The Penguin Historical Atlas of the Vikings, is an outstanding work that I wish I had read first in my studies of the Vikings. It is the most basic of the 4 books in some ways, yet it manages to cover the history, culture, and geography of the Vikings all in 144 pages in very readable manner, yet it's not dumbed down. I don't get a sense in reading this that, hey, this is for adolescents or somehow this is dumbed down at all. I don't get that at all. This is exactly the kind of book that a beginner should read, or for a teacher who needs to prepare a class or two on the Vikings. If you're a university student and you're taking a class on, let's say, medieval European history or history of England in the Middle Ages, Viking history, obviously, then this book will probably not be required by your professor, but this book you should get, and you'll be glad you did, because it's going to be very helpful for all those kinds of classes. This book is obviously, it's an atlas, so it's got colorful illustrations all throughout. It's got maps galore, charts on, and maps and illustrations on every page, it seems like. So the word count is actually low, but don't mistake that for being incomplete. Author Haywood packs a ton of information in a very concise format, and it is well written. It held my interest from start to finish, and it really gave me tremendous value for the space, time, and money involved. It's just a very concise format. It's simple without being simplistic, if that makes sense. And what may make the book even more impressive to me is the fact that I read this after those 3 other books, and it brought out so much that I had read, but the other books may have been a little over my head in places, and this book kind of brought some things out so that they were clear to my understanding. I really think the author did a masterful job in saying a lot in just a few pages. The obvious strength here is the maps. It is an atlas, and if you love maps, I think you're going to love this book. I grew up reading atlases. We had encyclopedias and atlases in the house growing up, and I would just sit there and look at maps all day long. The maps are well done. Almost every section has a map. Those that don't have maps have charts or pictures illustrating the points of that section. Now, there was a map on page 59 in the section, The Vikings in the Mediterranean, that I thought I discovered an error on. I thought, aha, I've caught the author in an error. The map shows the Vikings landing at the city of Luna on the southeast end of the Liguria coast because the Vikings mistook it for Rome. That's a funny story there. But the city was Luna on the map. And I knew that city as Luni, L-U-N-I, and that the city of Luna, L-U-N-A, was actually in the northeast of Italy, closer to Venice. But upon further research, I found that Luna was the older spelling of Luni. So the map is correct if you keep that into account. But on that map, the thing that really catches my attention is the fact that Luni is only about 70 miles down the coast from Genoa. Genoa is, of course, the birthplace of Christopher Columbus, who, the primary sources say, was about 6 foot tall, fair-skinned, and had red hair. Not your typical Italian profile. Is there a coincidence here that there were Vikings in that area 400 years before he was born? Nah, couldn't be, but it makes you wonder. Another strength of the book is its simple, straightforward organization. It starts with what amounts to an introduction, but it's not called an intro. It's called the Causes of the Viking Age. And then it moves into its 7 main parts. First part, the origins of the Vikings. Secondly, Scandinavia in the Viking Age. Third, the Viking raids. Fourth, the North Atlantic saga. Fifth, Vikings in the East. Sixth, the transformation of the Vikings. And that 6th section is really kind of the conclusion, but I kind of wish that there was a stronger conclusion. The transformation of the Vikings was an important chapter for me, for my purposes, what I'm looking at. Really, the 3 sections that were the most important to me, the Viking raids, the North Atlantic saga, and then the transformation of the Vikings. But the book then ends with a couple of pages listing Viking kings and rulers, which is very helpful. These charts, there's 2 or 3 charts throughout the book, are very helpful. So I would say the greatest weakness of the book is there's no really good summary, but that final section may serve the purpose adequately. In fact, that section, I just felt it needed a conclusion. The part on the North Atlantic saga, part 4, that was another section that I found very crucial for what I'm pursuing. The story of how did the Vikings come to discover America. That was, even though, again, very concise writing, few pages, but it just really made it very clear how that all happened. So it flows smoothly. This book is not clunky or difficult to read, which sometimes atlases can be. Sometimes atlases are so compartmentalized, but this really flowed well from start to finish. It wasn't clunky or chunky at all. Now, the author of the book, John Haywood, is a graduate of the University of Lancaster, Cambridge, and the University of Copenhagen. And he's an expert on Vikings and Celts, with a couple of dozen books on these subjects, including this one, The Northmen, the Viking saga, The Northmen by Haywood. So this is on my list of perhaps I need to read this soon. And Haywood currently teaches at the University of Lancaster, I think. There are different theories of studying and interpreting history, several different ideas of what can you do with what you've learned. I tend to look for examples in people and nations. I look for trends throughout history, for good or ill. The big story as well as the small compartmentalized stories I like. I think that we should gain some insights into our present days by looking at the vast storehouse of knowledge and experience that has gone before. Some people and nations can only learn from their own mistakes. I think it's far less costly to learn from other people or other nations' mistakes. But then there's the idea of, hey, what can you learn from history? Well, you learn that people don't learn from history and they keep making the same mistakes over and over. You see that in individual lives and you see it in the course of nations. So what can we learn here from the Vikings and from Haywood's book? I'm going to read some quotes and discuss them with my amateur analysis here. So page 53. This is in the section on the Viking raids, right? Part 3, the Viking raids. The most damaging aspect of the Vikings' activities was their attacks on monasteries, which were the main cultural centers of early medieval Europe. The revival of learning fostered by Charlemagne, known as the Carolingian Renaissance, had collapsed before the end of the 9th century, while the brilliant monastic culture of early Christian Ireland never recovered from the Viking attacks. Analysis. At least a couple of the other authors that I've read about the Vikings have said similar things. It seems to be a consensus amongst Viking scholars that, hey, the Viking raids really did some long-lasting damage to the church and to the Carolingian Renaissance to Europe. But what can we make of this? Lessons learned, maybe. I do not think it was an accident or a coincidence that the Vikings attacked the monasteries. I tend to think they did careful reconnaissance of the monasteries, probably through their trade contacts. One year it's a trade or merchant mission, the next year a Viking raid. But none of the other authors seem to mention this, unless I missed it. All the authors, I think, mentioned that, yeah, the Vikings were a combination of merchants and explorers and pirate warriors. Like in 2 Kings chapter 20 in the Bible, with the king of Judah, Hezekiah, showing all his wealth to the envoys from a foreign country called Babylon. And then Isaiah the prophet calls him out for it. This was foolish, and sure enough. It's not wise to show too much to those whom you think are foreign merchants. They may come back some morning in ships with strong men, well armed, who will take what you have and kill you for their trouble. The Vikings did not initially raid the palaces and fortresses of kings, though that came later. They chose the defenseless monasteries first. They gained wealth. That wealth gave them power. That emboldened them. And then they came back to England for more, came back to France for more. It is the way of thugs, pirates, and tyrants to take what they want from people who are unprepared. Preparation for war is the best means of preventing war. This is the law of the jungle. And those who think that mankind or society has evolved past this simply don't understand the sin nature or the examples of history. And we forget this to our own peril. There be Vikings lurking out there over the horizon. Be ready. And spiritually speaking, I do believe in a real devil, a real Satan, demons, and I'm convinced that they have their impact and influence in the course of human affairs. It does not surprise me that a nation of pagans attacked a nation of Christians and attacked the spiritual centers, the monasteries, first. While the Vikings themselves may have been only after gold and silver, slaves and women, and maybe they didn't really care about the whole religious aspect of it, the spiritual forces at work in history were trying to damage the church, and that they did. Yet, within a few generations, in God's sovereignty, the Vikings themselves were converted to the Christian faith. God is at work in history, and that's part of what I'm trying to discover as I do these studies. Let me take a drink of some Icelandic water here that is sold locally here in Fort Worth. at every quick trip in the area, and I think Albertsons has this, and who knows what, but think about that. Water from a spring in Iceland is loaded on a ship and transported all the way to Fort Worth, Texas. Yeah, that's about a $3 bottle there, so somebody's making a killing off of melted glacier. Or actually, this is spring water. So, now, page 96 in our book here is another key quote I want to look at. This is about the Vikings in Greenland. Eric the Red returned to Iceland to persuade others to follow him, and in 986 set out again with 25 ships going to Greenland. Only 14 made it around Cape Farewell, but this was enough to found 2 settlements. A ship reaching the eastern settlement, however, in 1540, 556 years later, found only deserted farms, and in one of them, a single unburied body. Now, first of all, notice there is something funny about the founding of Greenland. Eric the Red, who had some legal problems back in Norway and back in Iceland, Eric the Red kind of went to Greenland, and because people had reported seeing this island there, he comes back and calls it Greenland and leads an expedition to go back there. There's no trees in Greenland, maybe some small dwarf birch trees, and that's about it. But as a salesman, he labels it as Greenland. So this is one of the original scams, right? I found that kind of humorous. But so they go to Greenland. Notice the casualty rate. They set out with 25 ships. Only 14 make it around Cape Farewell. I think Cape Farewell is in Iceland. No, that's Greenland. That's the southern tip of Greenland. And so on the west side of Greenland is where they settle. The eastern settlement is there on the southern tip of Greenland, just around Cape Farewell. And then you've got a middle settlement, and then the western settlement, and a northern settlement, all on the west coast of Greenland. So Cape Farewell, only 14 out of 25 ships make it that far. That's close to a 50% casualty rate. So notice that. Some may have turned back, but I doubt. I mean, when you're all the way to Greenland, I mean, what are you going to do, turn back when you're there? I think most of these are lost in the vast Atlantic Ocean. Maybe some capsized and sunk. Maybe some got wrecked on an iceberg where the survivors slowly froze to death or starved. Maybe some were just lost there in the Atlantic and they were floating around until they ran out of supplies and died. That's a horrible thing. But get this. Their willingness to sustain losses for the purpose of exploration and founding a new colony was amazing. And I'm afraid it is totally absent from us, their descendants, the products of European civilization. We have become risk averse. Now notice also that Greenland survived as a colony for 500 years, and then they died off. I mean, that sentence, a ship reaching the eastern settlement in 1540, 556 years later, found one body unburied. The rest of the farm's deserted. Can you imagine being the last living Greenlander? Everybody else has died. You haven't seen a ship in years. You've run out of supplies, and you're dying alone, freezing to death, starving to death. The Greenlanders left no written records that we know of. People who immigrated back to Iceland took the poetry, the stories back with them. All that's left is the archaeological record in Greenland. Empty houses, farms, churches, graves. We don't know all the reasons for the failure of the colony to survive, but we do know the climate changed. It grew colder. There was a mini ice age that settled in over Europe, the North Atlantic and North America then. The Greenlanders failed to learn from their Eskimo neighbors who did survive, but barely. It is a hard thing for a long-lived culture to change when hard times are forced upon it. Perhaps a plague got loose. Maybe war with the native Eskimos contributed. We know that no trees grow in Greenland. There's no grain crops that can grow in England or in Greenland. So they depended on hunting, fishing, whaling. They had maybe a little bit of garden produce, but their imports of wood and grain came from other places. And if you lose your boats, you can't build more. And so trade slowed down and stopped. They lost all their crews. When that last boat sent out for wood to build more boats failed to return, they were cut off. Can you imagine that? It's like a Twilight Zone episode, being the last Greenlander. What can we learn here? Exploring and colonizing is a risky business, dangerous, both in the short term and in the long haul. When you study the early history of America and the explorers and the settlers, very high casualty rates. We're not willing to accept that anymore. Greenland died off after 5 centuries. The colonies of the Western European nations have all rebelled or have given up. The cultures of Rhodesia, Kenya, South Africa, Lebanon, Hong Kong, those cultures have all been changed now. Different ownership. There's much talk about establishing a colony on the moon or on Mars. Before Elon Musk attempts this, he and everyone involved should read about the Vikings, Iceland, Greenland, Vinland. Our culture today is undergoing a radical change, a revolution at many levels. Toxic masculinity, like what the Vikings had, is out. Can we survive if the Vikings couldn't? In conclusion, I highly recommend The Penguin, Historical Atlas of the Vikings by John Haywood. If you're a beginner in the study of Vikings, if you want just one book on the subject, this is it. That's all for now, but I'm going to be reading at least one more big book on the Vikings, so I shall return, hopefully. Stab the Dragon, out here.